He was mocked for growing crops in rocky soil, then his harvest silenced everyone. In June 2020, eastern Kentucky logged its driest month in 62 years. Creeks shrank to trickles. Dust rose off the county roads in thin brown clouds behind every passing truck. By the 4th of July, cornfields across 3 counties had turned the color of straw, the leaves curling tight against the heat. Farmers stood at their fence lines in the early morning, arms crossed, watching crops they'd planted with good money wither by 9 o'clock. But on one steep rocky hillside outside the town of Bell's Fork, 6 acres of corn stood dark green, stalks tall and heavy-eared, untouched by the drought choking everything around it. Neighbors slowed their trucks just to look at it. Some pulled over entirely. Nobody could explain why the worst dirt on the ridge, ground 3 generations of farmers had written off as useless, hadn't burned up like everything else that summer. The man who owned that hillside wasn't celebrating. He was just checking a drip line between 2 rows, sleeves rolled up, boots gray with shale dust, like it was any other Tuesday. His name was Wyatt Coleman. 3 years earlier, half the county had laughed at him for even trying to plant that ground at all. Wyatt was 34 that summer. He'd lived his whole life on Coleman Ridge Farm, in a white clapboard house his grandfather built in 1951, its porch boards worn smooth by 3 generations of boots. The farm covered 140 acres. 100 of them were good bottomland along Sorrow Creek, dark soil that had fed the family for 70 years. The other 40 climbed a steep ridge behind the barn, thin soil over gray shale, more rock than dirt, where nothing grew taller than scrub cedar and blackberry bramble. No one in 3 generations had pulled a real crop out of that ridge. Earl had grazed a few goats up there once, and even they'd struggled on the thin grass. Wyatt's younger brother, Cole, had left for Lexington at 19, and their mother, Sue, used to say Cole had the sense to know when a place was done with you. Cole worked at a shipping warehouse now, drove a car that still smelled new, and came home twice a year with stories about traffic and overtime pay. Wyatt had never left. He fixed fence, fed cattle, and rotated hay fields the same way his father and grandfather had, year after year, on the good 100 acres everyone agreed were worth the trouble. Earl never said it outright. But everyone in Bell's Fork knew which son he expected to have the sense to leave that ridge alone. It wasn't Wyatt. Wyatt used to walk up there some evenings after chores, just to look at all that useless ground and wonder why it bothered him so much that nobody had ever tried. In February 2017, a company called Ridgeline Solar knocked on the Coleman door. They wanted to lease 25 acres of the rocky section for a solar array, $92,000 over the life of the lease, paid whether the ground ever grew a thing or not. It was more cash than the ridge had made the family in 60 years combined. Earl told him to take it. "That ground's never grown a thing but sassafras and heartbreak," Earl said over supper, setting down his fork like the matter was settled. Wyatt sat with the offer for 2 weeks. He drove up to the ridge more than once, kicked at the loose shale, and thought about what $92,000 could fix on the rest of the farm. Then he turned it down. Instead, he pulled $18,400 from his own savings, money he'd set aside for a newer tractor, and spent it on steel drums, seed corn, fencing wire, and diesel. Earl didn't speak to him for 3 days after that. If the ridge failed him, Wyatt would have no tractor, no solar check, and a torn-up hillside with nothing to show for it but a hard lesson. That March, while clearing the old hay barn to make room for a burn kiln, Wyatt found a rusted tin box wedged behind a support beam, orange with age and dented on one corner. Inside was a folded note in his grandfather's handwriting, brittle at the creases, the ink gone brown. It read, "The mountain won't grow what you plant. It grows what you feed it. E.C., 1962. Wyatt read it twice, turned it over looking for more, and found nothing. He didn't know what it meant. He set the box on his windowsill and left it there. Then he started hauling loads of broken shale, scrap lumber, and old fence posts up to the ridge after dark, working by headlight some nights until 11. He didn't explain why, not even to Earl. Word got around fast in a town the size of Bell's Fork. Some folks figured he was building something to hide from the county. Others guessed he'd finally lost patience with the solar company and was fencing off the land out of spite. Hollis Pratt, who farmed the bottomland next door, watched smoke from Wyatt's night burns drift over the ridge for a week straight, thick and gray against the dark. "Rocks don't grow corn, boy," Hollis told him one Saturday at the feed store, loud enough for 2 other men to hear. "Never have. Never will." You're wasting good diesel." Wyatt just nodded and kept loading his truck. The idea hadn't come from nowhere. 2 winters earlier, Wyatt had gone to a soil health workshop at the county extension office, mostly to get out of the cold and drink the free coffee. Folding chairs, a projector propped on a stack of phone books, maybe 15 farmers in the room. The speaker was Dr. Alice Renner, a retired University of Kentucky soil scientist, 68 years old, with a slideshow of dense green farmland that looked nothing like Kentucky. She talked about ancient farmers along the Amazon River who had turned poor, thin jungle soil into some of the richest farmland on Earth, soil so fertile that scientists still study it today. They hadn't used fertilizer. They had used charcoal. She called it biochar. Biochar is charcoal made by heating wood or plant matter with very little oxygen, a process called pyrolysis. Instead of burning to ash, the material turns into a stable, porous form of carbon full of tiny pockets. Mixed into soil, those pockets hold water and nutrients like a sponge. They also give beneficial microbes a place to live. In thin, rocky ground that drains too fast to hold a rainstorm, biochar can be the difference between a crop that survives August and one that doesn't. After the talk, Wyatt stayed behind while the others filed out and asked Dr. Renner one question. Could it work on shale? She said nobody had really tried it on ground quite like his. That was enough for him. He drove home that night already picturing the ridge covered in corn. That first spring, Wyatt burned scrap wood in open piles on the ridge, let it cool overnight, and crushed the char by hand with the back of a shovel. He tilled the black powder straight into a half-acre test plot and planted corn the second week of May, the same week Earl planted the bottomland. By mid-June, the bottomland corn stood knee-high and green. Wyatt's ridge corn was ankle-high and pale yellow, the leaves striped with a kind of color that meant something was wrong. He drove into town and found Dr. Renner again, catching her just before she left the extension office for the day. She walked the rows once, crouched down, and pulled up a stunted stalk by the root. "You charged it in raw," she said. "Fresh char pulls nitrogen straight out of the soil before your corn roots ever reach it. You fed the charcoal, not the corn." Even the untouched ridge soil usually gave about 18 bushels an acre in a fair year. Wyatt's half-acre test gave him 5 bushels total that fall. 10 bushels an acre. His fix had made things worse, and he knew it before he'd even finished picking. Dr. Renner told him the char needed to be charged before it went in the ground, soaked in something nutrient-rich, so it would feed the soil instead of stealing from it. That winter, Wyatt built a proper retort out of 2 steel drums, one set inside the other with an inch of air gap between them, so the wood inside burned in a low-oxygen chamber instead of open flame. It took him 3 tries to get the seal right. The new method gave him more usable charcoal and far less ash than his first open-pile burns. Once he had a full drum of crushed char, he soaked it in a stock tank filled with water and cattle manure for 6 weeks, stirring it every few days with an old fence post. By the end of 6 weeks, the char had turned dark and dense, and it smelled like rich compost instead of ash. In April, working most nights so the neighbors wouldn't see another failure before he knew if it worked, Wyatt trenched the charged char 12 inches deep into new rows on the ridge, then covered it and waited. By July, the difference showed from the road. The corn stood knee-high and dark green, weeks ahead of where the failed plot had been the year before. Earl drove past it twice that month without saying anything, though Wyatt noticed he slowed down both times. That October, Wyatt harvested 1.5 acres of treated ridge ground. 58 bushels an acre. More than 3 times the ridge's old average, on ground that had never grown a real crop in Earl's lifetime. It wasn't a bottomland yield. The good fields along Sorrow Creek still averaged around 155 bushels an acre most years. But it was proof, in real bushels and real dollars, that the ridge could grow something worth harvesting. Wyatt kept a handwritten note of the numbers taped inside the barn door that winter, right next to his grandfather's tin box on the shelf. That success didn't end the work. It started a longer one. The next spring, Wyatt expanded his treated ground to 3 acres. The spring after that, to 6. Getting there wasn't smooth. In May of his second full season, 4 inches of rain fell in one night, the kind of storm that turned the gravel driveway into a creek. Runoff tore through his new trenches before the young corn had rooted deep enough to hold the soil, carrying black streaks of char and topsoil down toward the barn. By morning, Wyatt found bare trenches where rows had stood the day before. He lost almost a third of that season's planting overnight. He fixed it the way the ridge had been telling him to all along, with its own rock. He and Earl spent 3 weekends stacking loose shale into low check dams across the slope, terracing the rows so water slowed down and soaked in instead of running straight off the mountain. It was slow, aching work, hauling stone by hand in the June heat. But it held. The rock that had mocked him for years, the same shale Hollis said would never grow corn, became the thing that kept his soil in place. That same winter, Earl had a heart attack while shoveling snow off the porch steps. Wyatt found him slumped against the railing and called an ambulance from the kitchen phone, hands shaking so badly he had to repeat the address twice. Earl spent 9 days in the hospital in Hazard. Wyatt ran the farm alone the whole stretch, splitting his days between the hay barn and a hospital chair, sleeping in his truck in the parking lot more than once. When Earl came home, thinner and slower, moving with a cane he hated, he sat on the porch one evening and watched Wyatt haul feed to the calves in the last light. "Your grandfather tried something like this once," Earl said quietly, nodding up toward the ridge. "Burned brush piles up there back in the 60s. Never got it to work right. Didn't have the science for it. Reckon you do." It was the first kind word Earl had ever said about that ridge, and Wyatt didn't trust himself to answer right away. The next setback came from Wyatt's own kiln. To treat 6 acres, he needed far more char than his 2-drum retort could produce in a single season. That March, days before planting, the inner drum split clean along an old weld, hissing steam and spilling half a batch of good char into the dirt. Wyatt drove into Bell's Fork and found Mose Tackett, the town's blacksmith, a broad-shouldered man in his 60s with forearms scarred pale from 40 years of sparks, who whistled old hymns under his breath while he worked and never seemed to stop moving. Mose turned the cracked drum over twice, tapped it with a wrench, and shook his head. He built Wyatt a new retort out of a retired propane tank instead, thick-walled enough to survive years of burns, welding it himself over 2 afternoons. "Earl's boy digging trenches at midnight," Mose said, grinning around the toothpick in his mouth. "Whole town's talking about you." He charged Wyatt half his usual rate and called it the curiosity discount, on the condition Wyatt bring him a sack of that ridge corn come fall. By early June that year, the signs were already there, for anyone paying attention. Sorrow Creek ran lower than Earl had ever seen it for that time of year, gravel bars showing where there should have been 3 feet of water. Cicadas started their drone 2 weeks early, and kept it up through the hottest part of the afternoon. The county extension office sent out a dry conditions notice that most farmers barely read past the first line. "Driest spring I can remember," Earl said one morning, squinting at the creek bed and the cracked mud along its edge. Nobody in Bell's Fork knew yet just how bad it would get. That summer became the driest June in 62 years for the county. By July, bottomland corn that should have stood shoulder-high was curling and pale by 9 in the morning, the leaves rolled tight to save what moisture they had left. Hollis Pratt's 80-acre bottom field, which usually brought in around 155 bushels an acre, finished that season closer to 52. Cracks opened across his ground wide enough to lose a boot in. Down the road, the farm pond behind the old Grange Hall dropped 4 feet, exposing the rusted frame of a plow someone had lost in the mud decades before. The county extension office estimated corn yields across the region had fallen by more than a third that year. Up on the ridge, Wyatt's 6 acres told a different story. The Biochar-rich soil, packed with pockets that had been holding spring rain since April, still had water to give when everything around it had run dry. His corn stayed green into August, tassels standing tall while the bottomland browned around it. When Wyatt totaled his numbers that October, the treated ridge came in at 61 bushels an acre, not just holding steady from the year before, but now higher than Hollis's prime bottomland in the worst drought in 6 decades. Hollis drove up one afternoon in September, parked at the fence line, and stood there for a long minute, looking at the green rows above his own brown fields down the valley. He walked 1 row, rubbed a leaf between his fingers, and got back in his truck without a word. Word traveled fast after that. By the following spring, Hollis was the first neighbor to ask Wyatt for help building a retort of his own, standing in the barn with his hat in his hands, asking questions he'd have laughed off 2 years earlier. 2 more farms along the Ridge Road followed within a year, the bowling place among them, and a young couple who'd bought the old Sims property next. Dr. Renner started bringing extension groups out to walk Wyatt's rows, including a county agent named Denise Combs, who took notes in a spiral pad so worn the cover had come off, and who told Wyatt more than once that his field was the best teaching tool she'd found in 20 years on the job. By 2022, 22 acres across 3 farms in Bell's Fork were growing on charged biochar, ground that 5 years earlier had been written off as worthless. There was no ribbon cutting. No sign at the county fair. Just more green where there used to be nothing but rock. Wyatt still keeps his grandfather's tin box on the windowsill above the sink. He understands the note now. Ezra Coleman hadn't been talking about soil that needed to be strong. He'd been talking about soil that needed to be fed. The land doesn't ask to be strong, Wyatt says now, when people ask about the ridge. It just asks to be fed.